jetzt würde ich Ihnen gerne noch das Team vom heutigen Abend vorstellen. Und zwar ist das zum einen meine Kollegin Isabelle Lemaitre. Sie ist beim Klett und Palmen Verlag ebenfalls als Produktmanagerin für das Lehrmittel New World zuständig. Hi Isabelle.
Guten Abend, es freut mich, sind Sie heute alle mit dabei.
Und gerne stelle ich Ihnen auch noch die Referentin vom heutigen Abend vor. Das ist Dina Blanco. Sie ist Lehrerausbilderin, Englischpädagogin und Dozentin an der FHNW. Hi Dina.
Hi everybody.
Gut, jetzt wünsche ich Ihnen einen spannenden und aufschlussreichen Abend und übergebe gerne das Wort an Dina, wo Ihnen das Programm vom heutigen Abend wird zeigen.
Great. Thank you so much, Yasmin. I'd like to, first of all, warmly welcome you all today to this webinar. I'm really looking forward to it. A little bit nervous, but I'm sure everything is going to work out just fine. And I'd just like to tell you briefly what the aim of this webinar is today. So it's very much about keeping L1 learners engaged. So the idea is, how do we challenge advanced learners? So before we look at some very simple practical applications, the first thing I'd like to do is briefly lay the foundations by understanding some core differentiation principles through Tomlinson's and Bloom, because that will feed in to the practical applications. And then we're going to explore some practical strategies for challenging advanced and L1 learners. As Yasmin already said, we're going to have a breakout session where you will have access to the slides as a PDF. So hopefully you'll be able to share ideas, what you've been doing so far, and also have a look at the ideas that I'll be sharing today. And then we'll come back, share your insights, hopefully, and finish off with a Q&A and with a Padlet follow-up where we hope you're going to put in the ideas that you shared in your groups so that we can make it available to you following the workshop. But I'll make that clear as we move on. So, like I said, I'm mainly focusing today on New World, the new edition with the 3 G and 3E, and also with Open World 1. However, I want to stress that even though I'll be exploring and looking at some specific examples, the strategies that I'm sharing with you today, you can use them across the different course books. So it doesn't necessarily matter that whether or not you're using New World 3 at the moment, or whether you're using more up-level course books, okay? These strategies can be applied across the board. So I just wanted to clarify that as well with you. So let's get started then. And what we'd like to explore first, why is it there we go, is according to Tice, and as you well know, every language classroom in secondary school is said to be mixed ability. So we have a range of levels in one class, and that can be our struggling or the low-level learners, and also learners, which is the main focus of our workshop today, that possibly need more of a challenge. So we know that the term mixed ability refers to a group where individual differences are very pronounced. And this can be according to the different productive and receptive skill levels. It can be based on grammatical or lexical differences. Also, we need to think about the different learning styles in our classrooms, the speed that they learn, their aptitude. Also, remember that our learners bring in different background knowledge and knowledge of the world, and also considering the age, the maturity of our levels, and also, of course, motivation. So there are so many things that come into play when we look at a mixed ability classroom. Now, the challenge for us as teachers is For advanced or L1/native speakers, now please be aware, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably during the webinar, but they all refer to the same thing. So basically, it's these learners that need more of a challenge. Because what we find is that for most of us, we tend to typically differentiate down. In other words, we typically try our best to support those weaker learners rather than differentiating up or upgrading for learners that need more of a challenge. And I think we're all guilty of this. For most teachers, for many of us, the easiest option to provide learners with more of a challenge is to provide them with extra work to do. So in other words, we may want to give them extra worksheets or extra activities, or even some cases in which I've experienced is that even though they attend the English language lesson, but then they're just, well, they're too advanced, teachers might even choose to say, well, how about we take out your book and have a read for 45 minutes, because that might be an option. But this is all micro differentiation. And one thing about doing this in terms of reading, we don't want this to feel like it's a punishment. You know, we want to promote extensive reading. So we want our learners to enjoy reading. And we also don't want it to feel like a punishment by constantly just giving them more worksheets to do, for instance. It's about not providing them with more work, but different work. So the challenge is providing them with authentic, creative, and intellectually engaging work. And of course, this means that in the classroom, even though we have so many mixed levels, that everybody, as far as possible, is working on task. That is absolutely the ideal. So our North Star this evening is to rethink what challenge really means in mixed ability English language classrooms. First of all, a point that I really need to highlight. At the moment, this may well change. The Lehrplan 21 for English provides descriptors up to the B1, 1, 2 levels, which is the third side clause. And it doesn't mean that everybody's going to reach that level. It doesn't, at the moment, this could change, actually include higher competence bands from, let's say, B2 upwards. And if we're talking about L1 or native speaker learners, then, well, somehow we'll find that they're actually missing. So understandably, as teachers, we may feel a little bit stuck, even though, and this is what I think is a really positive thing, New World, for instance, does provide G and E option course books and also provides us with additional resources that aim to support you to provide appropriate level tasks for those learners that need more of a challenge. So we're going to explore practical ways, and I hope you will use these strategies to stretch L1 and advanced learners while ensuring that we keep the whole class engaged, active and motivated, and that they're learning together across open world and new world. So first of all, I'm going to briefly, I'm not going to go into I'm not going to go into it very deeply, but I think we need to explore differentiation from two perspectives. And first of all, I'm going to just explore the differentiation framework, which is based on Carol Tomlinson's framework. The word differentiation is actually thanks to Carol Tomlinson's work, and she's, well, some people call her the godmother of differentiation. She's actually the person who actually termed differentiation. So Carol Tomlinson's work. So whatever when we talk about differentiation, you can think about Carol Tomlinson's work. Now, she describes a differentiated classroom as one which provides different ways for learners to acquire content, to process or make sense of ideas, and to develop products so that each learner in our classroom can learn effectively. And she does that through 3 different approaches to differentiation. Now, when we're talking about differentiation, we really are also talking about us as teachers being proactive. So when you know that you have these learners in your classrooms that need more of a challenge, so these advanced learners, L1 learners, we need to actually think about planning in advance for the differences, not just for those, but overall, that we know exist in our classrooms. Now, Tomlinson breaks this down into 3 ways we can differentiate. Now, like I said, I'm doing this very briefly, but this provides the framework on which the strategies and the practical applications we're going to look at later links to. So she suggests we can differentiate the content. This is what the learners engage with. That can be the input, for example, reading or listening tasks, the ideas, or the different materials. She also talks about differentiating process. This is how learners, and I'll use this, how learners make sense of that content. So it's about the thinking, the interaction in the classroom, or also the support we build in. And finally, we can also differentiate the product. This is how learners demonstrate that they've understood, okay? So how they demonstrate their learning. So it's basically the outcome. So what's really good about this model of differentiation is that it's flexible. So as a teacher, we're not going to sit down and think about how we're going to integrate all 3 of these differentiation strategies into our classroom. You just need to, and this is what I hope you would get from this today, you just need to perhaps make small intentional adjustments in even one of these areas to actually make sure that all your learners are challenged at the right level. So if we take New World and Open World, I think this is what they do fantastically well, because I think the plus for me is that New World and Open World have short units. They're like 5 units in each course book. But what they do especially well is that the content, so what they have in terms of the input and the activities, both the reading activities, the listening, the writing, all the skills, plus grammar and vocabulary, it's built on throughout the unit. So they progress through each unit or through the unit. And then at the end of that unit, there's, in Open World, for example, a focus task. All right, so we can very much argue it's very much a TBL type of framework, okay? So at the end, they use the language, they use everything that they've learned in order to, in this case, have or create an interview about healthy living. So that's the product, all right? So the input and the processes, and then here is the final product that learners are going to do at the end. And in the same way, in New World, this is the new edition, at the end of Unit 2, the final product is where learners will need to create a poster about their healthy role model. So these are examples of 2 finished products whereby the skills are integrated, and like I said, it moves through the content, the processes, and then the product. Another area that we need to consider is about how do we challenge our learners' thinking. So this is the adding the cognitive depth. So I am not sure, but hopefully I'm hoping that most of you have heard of Bloom's. He's been around for a long time. And what Bloom's did was provide us with a taxonomy of thinking skills. Okay, and we're just going to explore how this works. So remember, at this lovely little point, remember, differentiation isn't just more work, it's deeper work. And this is where Bloom's fits nicely into the construct. So you can have a look at this slide. I'm not going to read through it, but I'll just give you an overview, and you can have more time to look at this in your own time when you get the PDF of the slides. But basically, this is a quick visual of Bloom's cognitive processes dimension. So it's a way of thinking this as the depth of learning. So at the bottom, we have remember, understand. Apply comes kind of up a little bit, but these thinking skills are what we call the lower order thinking skills, or LOTs. Now here, these are activities where learners simply ask, where students are simply asked to remember or understand things like recalling vocabulary, maybe explaining grammar rules or summarizing, etc. However, as we move up the levels, so apply, analyze, evaluate, and create, the thinking becomes more complex and independent. So when we think about those learners that need more of a challenge, okay, it's this upper part of the table where we really challenge them by asking them to interpret, justify, design, or produce something original. But please remember, the goal isn't to keep everyone at that top level all the time, but it's also about building lessons that move between levels. So when we think of Bloom's taxonomy, well, how can we apply it just quite simply? Now, we're all guilty of this, but sometimes, not a lot of times, I think we need to also start simply by rethinking the questions that we ask our learners. This actually requires no extra planning or materials. So one of the simplest ways to add challenge, especially for advanced learners, is to look at the questions we ask them. Often, the classroom questions, or the questions we ask, sit on the lower levels of Bloom's. Things like what happened or who said that. Now, those check understanding and quite fine for, let's say, the lower level areas, but they're not actually necessarily pushing thinking for advanced or L1 learners. So what if we just, let's say, tweak that a little bit and think, okay, how can I get more response from my learners? How can I challenge their thinking? So what if instead we asked our learners, why do you think this happened? Or what would happen if? How could you reimagine this situation, for instance? Another way of looking at these questions is we call them thick questions, which are very open and require more of a response from learners, or thin questions, which are usually questions that require a one-word or very simple response. So what we have here, so I've taken this out from a really great book. It's by White, and it's called Activities for English Language Learners Across the Curriculum. And what's really cool about this is that he provides like a list of questions for the different levels of thinking. The only difference here, he starts from remembering from the top and working from creating at the bottom. So these are lovely examples. I'm not going to go through them, but I will definitely ask you to have a look at these questions and see how you could possibly use them in your classrooms for those advanced learners. So this one is for early advanced level. And there's also one for the bridging. So maybe you can just reflect for a moment and perhaps think of a question you asked in class this week, especially for those learners that need more of a challenge. maybe start thinking about, well, how could I possibly rephrase that question? How could I make it more open or challenging for those learners? How can I take it a step further? Okay. And then when you even go into the course books, and I'm going to give you some examples, how can I just tweak those questions? Like I said, sometimes it's just as simple as tweaking the questions we ask our learners. Now I'm going to go through some examples. Now, of course, we do not have time to go through, I could have, but I didn't, every single part of the course book. So what I've done is I've just chosen a couple of units which are similar in New World and Open World. But like I said, please remember the ideas that I'm sharing are applicable throughout. So let's then, now that we've touched a little bit on the theory, how then does that look like in practice? How do these principles translate into the classroom? So we're going to share some examples. And the first one I've done is I've taken the first example from Open World Unit 6, which I really like because it develops reading strategies. I think this task is pretty awesome. And it's where does all the plastic go? So you might be familiar with it, but so this is what I could do. Again, based on differentiating, the content, the process, and the product. So first of all, I'm going to look at what are perhaps simple ways I can differentiate the content. In other words, the reading text. It could also be the listening, but I think one thing that New World and Open World both do really well is that they actually do use a lot of authentic videos in the course books. There's a lot there already. So differentiating content, like I said, it's about perhaps just tweaking, changing the content a little bit in order to make it more of a challenge for those learners. Simply, what we can do is add a short, authentic, and nowadays, so I will be touching upon AI because we can't ignore it, it's here. And if anything, it's also started to make our lives easier as teachers in order to create texts that are at a higher level. So that's a bonus point. But what we could do, for example, is create a short text which would be different from the one in the course book, perhaps looking at the garbage patch. It talks about the garbage patch from perhaps a local activist's blog post or opinion piece. We can also integrate a visual, an infographic, or a short news clip. We can also get learners to compare the tone or perspective from two different text types that we've perhaps created. So that's one way we can differentiate the content. So I'll give you an example, and this is what I did. I asked, whatever AI tool you want to use, but I asked Mr. ChatGPT for me. I put in the prompt and I said, I asked it to generate a 100 to 120 word social media post by a teenager living near the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And this is what it produced for me. So already I'm upgrading. I've just simply, it takes less than a minute to produce some content, some upgraded content. However, please may I remind you, don't just take what the AI tool spouts out. You really need to check it as well. Okay, so that's really important. So what I will provide you with is a reusable prompt that you could use. So this reusable, adaptable prompt gives you huge flexibility. So you can just change a couple of things to create more new or authentic feeling input, if you like. And you can just change 3 things. So, for example, you can change the genre. You can change the word length. So again, even within the same scope of your different learners, you might have even a text which has more words. Okay, so you can do that quite simply. We can change the point of view. We can also, so who it's written by, that's the identity. And we can also add more context. So here, living near or in. And by just using this prompt and changing it up, you can create new text. But like I said, please make sure you check. And also when you're using such prompts, you can also add the language level. So you can say, I would like it at a B2 or / upper intermediate. But please check, because AI hasn't quite got it yet in terms of the levels of the SEFRA, but it's getting there. So now we've got our content. So that was just one way of showing you how we can differentiate the content in terms of creating those new texts. Then we can look at, okay, how can we differentiate the process? In other words, how can we differentiate the questions we ask our learners? So this is taken from Open World. And as you can see, these are fine. These are questions that are fine, but they're very lower level order questions, which are great for learners that are okay with those sort of questions, but doesn't really challenge our advanced learners. Again, we can simply change the questions ourselves, or we can also, again, we can use AI to ask them, okay, could you possibly provide alternative questions? Again, be careful with what you ask, and it could be linked to the text that you created beforehand, for instance. But let's just have a look how we can do or differentiate or upgrade questions. So one of the questions was, where does the plastic come from? And I asked for sort of more moderate versions, which is sort of the understand, apply. And also we've got a more higher order, which moves up to the analysis, evaluate, and create. So for example, instead of where does the plastic come from, we can have questions like, what are the main sources of the plastic and how do everyday habits contribute? Okay, again, if you want to use the same text, fine. You can just tweak those questions a little bit, but this just shows you how we can just change the questions. And the same goes for part 3. So how does the plastic get into the garbage patch? Let's have a look at a higher order. We might ask learners to produce a model or a map of the journey of one item. So yes, we've thrown away the bottle, but how does it go from the land to the garbage patch? Again, they're all on the same topic, but we're just giving them different things to do, a different stance point, but everybody's on topic. And here are just some other examples, which you will have time to explore at your own time. Okay, so let's have a look at another example. Now here I'm using New World G level, the new edition in Unit 5, Scotland, a country of myths and traditions. Now I have to say what I love about the new edition of New World is how clearly it's structured for each unit. It actually shows us where we're going to start from and what the finished product with the little flag is at the end. So it tells learners this is the path that we're going to. I really like the way Clet has done this. I really do like this. So let's have a look with this example. Okay. So let's say we're only using the G version with our learners, but we have advanced learners in the classroom. Again, I can think about differentiating the content. So this is the text that is in the reading text that is there in the course book, and on the right are the questions. Again, they're quite low order questions, which is fine for the majority of our learners, but what do we do with those advanced learners? Again, we could adapt the content. So what I did was, it was such an easy text to actually type up. But what I did was I decided, well, I want to ensure that all my learners, irrespective of level, are actually focusing on a similar context. So here it talks about we visited Loch Ness in October 99 at the village of Foyers. There were many tourists at the lake when my sister and I arrived. We were there to see the Loch Ness Monster, so on and so forth. Suddenly we heard a strange noise, and I was totally shocked when I saw something appear on the opposite beach, and so on and so forth. Which is fine, absolutely lovely for the majority of our learners. But again, simple text, but I want to upgrade it, not change the context, but just upgrade it in terms of the language, the grammar, the vocabulary, etc. I'm not promoting TWE. I do not get any commission for TWE at all, but I'm just going to say it because what I like about TWE, I think you can use it with different languages, but it was specially designed for language teaching. So what I did with TWE is, but I'll show you can also do it with other AI tools. I simply typed in the text in the course book, and then I asked TWE to upgrade it. So that's where I clicked the upgrade. And it produced this text. So as you can see, it hasn't changed in terms of the number of words, I don't think. It's still very short and the context is still the same. So we visited Loch Ness in October 1999 at the village Foyers. That's the original. Whereas in the upgraded text that it's produced, in October 99, we ventured to Loch Ness, specifically the village of Foyers. All right, so everyone's still working on the same context, if you like, but the content in terms of language has been upgraded. And I just had an idea. You could even use these two texts. You can have the version from the course book, your upgraded text, and you can get learners to work in pairs and compare these two texts and highlight the differences, because that way then they're also learning new vocabulary. All right, so again, just we can do that quite simply by comparing those two texts. And if I wanted to go a step further, which I did with TWE, but no need to, I said, well, okay, like the text you created, and now I would like you to create questions with this text. So in TWE, they have the Sephra level. So I asked it to produce something in the B1 to B2. And then afterwards, I also asked it to produce something C1, C2. And here are the questions that it produced. But of course, you can simply do this on your whatever AI tool that you use. So this is an example that ChatGPT did for me. Again, still staying on the same context of the text. And then this is also an example of the questions it created for that text. All right, so here we've differentiated the content, we're differentiating the process, just with some small tweaks. Of course, we have, or CLET have New World E, which is geared towards those learners that are at a higher level. So I'm just going to we're going to look at the same unit, Unit 5, and just show you how even here, we can still, because there may be learners that still need that extra challenge, how we can still tweak that a little bit. So I love that a lot's being put into this new edition. I have to say, with the Erweiterung or the E version, there's a lot of great work has gone into this. I definitely want to say that. But nonetheless, yes, we can continue working with what's here. But again, depending on the learners, depending if you do have those learners that need that extra challenge beyond the E, for example, it provides us with opportunities to increase the cognitive demand. So again, by tweaking, changing the questions. There's also, I like the fact that there are 4 different texts. So it's not just like one reading as in Niveau, but here we have 4 different texts, which is great. And that's absolutely fine. But again, we can find ways of stretching our learners, all right? So perhaps expanding them again. So we can increase the word length, make them bigger, or we can also think about adding different perspectives, or we can ask learners to compare the different texts, even using these texts. What do you think these people are thinking? Who do you think's positive? Who do you think is expressing a positive idea, etc.? Where do you think these small texts have come from? Alternatively, we can also create alternative genres, such as a news report, a blog post, or a police report even, and compare those. Once again, in the E, of course, there are more deeper questions. So here, learners need to choose the statements they think are true and discuss them with a partner. But again, perhaps we can provide more opportunities to encourage even more deeper opinions and discussions. So I think all the reports of Nessie are typical examples of fake news. We can upgrade that even further by asking, okay, what argument do you find more convincing? Or thinking about how can we generate more speaking from these statements? Okay, so from these that we can even take it general. So when you talk about fake news, what is fake news? So they will express that in English. Can you give some examples? Again, just taking what's here and expanding this. Should you choose to keep expanding those so that we get learners to engage in the discussion? Okay. And finally, we can also afford them with opportunities to upgrade grammar activities or even lexical activities. So here, this is fine. I like that it's an awareness-raising activity where learners are asked to highlight the past simple. But at this level, again, it depends on the level of your advanced learners. And something actually I want to point out, and you probably have experienced this, it does not necessarily mean that L1 learners will be very good at grammar and vocabulary, and especially also with writing, because you need to remember that if English happens to be their L1, well, the learning of the grammar, I'm not going to go into second language acquisition theory, but the language, the grammar of the language is already embedded, so they've not really had to think about it. So it could be that these tasks or these types of activities are actually already quite fitting for your learners. Also, they probably need more support even when it comes to writing. So again, it depends. You know your learners. You know your learners and you know what sort of challenges they need or where they will need more support. So again, we can still use this type of activity, and we can possibly use a text that we generated earlier to highlight examples. But hey, why keep to the past simple form? Perhaps we also want them to, maybe we create a text that also includes other samples of the past tense, past continuous, for example, and past simple, and then ask them to highlight those grammatical points, and again, perhaps explore why is the past continuous used here? Why is the past simple used here? So again, we can challenge them even when it comes to the grammar. Okay, so those are specific examples which you can use irrespective with other areas in your course books. But now we're going to move on to further differentiation strategies for advanced learners. What strategies do I have for you? Well, we've looked at specific areas within the course book, but remember, and I keep stressing this, the idea here isn't to give advanced learners extra work, but it's about how do we make our tasks, the activities, more thought-provoking. And it also, I have to add, it isn't about you doing more work. Okay, it isn't. And I hope that these additional simple strategies that I have shared and will be sharing with you has shown how we can tweak what we teach with advanced learners in order to keep them engaged. And again, yes, we can now, with the use of AI, using it properly, this is actually so much easier as well. My God, when I think of when I was teaching and I wanted to simplify a text or upgrade a text, and I used to sit there with my dictionaries, with my thesaurus, and do it all by hand. But now we've got these tools that can certainly support us. So whether we're talking about reading, writing, listening, speaking, grammar, and vocabulary, we can easily shift from surface level understanding to more higher order thinking skills when we think about differentiating content, process, and product. So the next few strategies that I'm going to share, and you will have time to have a look at these possibly in more detail when you go into the breakout rooms, these are strategies that you can apply to any unit in open world or new world, or even or beyond, like anything, any course book you use, you can use these strategies. So quite simply, when we're thinking about the skills area and the language focus areas, so whether that's reading, writing, listening, speaking, grammar, vocabulary, the focus for challenge is we need to sort of go beyond understanding for reading. For writing, we go beyond accuracy. Excuse me. For listening, it's more than hearing the words. Speaking, really giving learners purposeful input, something that they can really get their teeth into. Okay, and one technique is especially cool, which I'll share, the Feynman technique, which is one way of getting advanced learners to explain things in simple language, which is a really cool way of actually teaching on if you want learners to work in different types of groups. And with grammar and vocabulary, we can go beyond by getting them to play with language, experiment, for example, with register, collocations, or sentence style. So with reading then, we want to move from what it says in the text to what it means. And this is already, when we think about reading skills, when we infer meaning from context, that already is a higher order thinking skill. So when we ask learners to interpret or infer meaning from context, whether it's comparing viewpoints, questions, or notice word choice, already we're making that challenging for them. All right, so here are some examples here. Another really cool idea that I've got here is comparing genres. So what makes this text more formal? What makes this text less formal? What language choices does the writer use in this text that demonstrates, exemplifies this? Writing, well, we need to go beyond just focusing on accuracy. And like I said just before, they probably will need that support, because it doesn't mean they're going to be, depending again, you know your learners, that they may be really good writers, irrespective if English is their L1. But again, we can write with purpose and get them to write with purpose and personality. So we can get them to write something which is formal and ask them to write something which is informal. So again, changing registers. A fun way is, well, how about you write this using a different type of personality? So you could be angry about something, you could be annoyed or delighted, because that will also generate and encourage learners to use alternative language as well, okay, that they will build in, and with your support, of course. Also, you can provide authentic model text. So if you want your learners to write, and this is across the board, but if you want your learners to write, let's say, a film review, use a real film review as a model. So that's like focusing on a product approach. What do they notice? And you can give a model into what you would like them to perhaps produce. And also allow learners perhaps to create their own success criteria. So what will make my writing interesting or effective? The listening, again, is very similar, because both listening and reading are receptive skills. So they do have similar types of task types. But again, even with listening, it's not just about perhaps understanding what's meant, but what about what's not said? So again, inferring meaning. And like I said, those videos that are provided for you, that's a great starting point to get learners to focus not just on the words, but to be able to question, what is the message? What is the speaker's mood? You can also ask them to compare two different, like you talk about videos or audios, tone or opinion. All right. And another really cool thing which works really well, which I like doing especially, is why don't you provide them with the answers to the listening or the reading? It works for both. You give them the answers, and then while they listen, in this case, listen, it can work with reading, they actually have to make notes to justify why, if it's a multiple choice, why is question 1 the correct answer is C? So they're not just listening, but they have to justify. The reason why it's C is because the speaker says this. Again, a small tweak, and it's kind of a really effective way of developing key listening strategies. And finally, with speaking, we need to make it more meaningful, again, with small tweaks. So I did mention earlier about the Feynman technique, and that's a technique where it's based on the idea that if you can explain something clearly to someone else, you truly understand it yourself. So, for example, you may ask a student to focus, again, those students, those advanced learners, give them a topic, or perhaps as a grammatical point, vocabulary, whatever it is in the unit, and then they need to prepare a 1 to 2 minute explanation in simple, clear language, as if they're teaching their younger brother or sister, or also using it as an opportunity to teach the other learners in the class. It doesn't always have to be you, okay? And then when they're teaching it, the other people in the group can ask them questions and they can clarify. And that's the Feynman technique, a lovely way of doing this. Another cool thing, I don't know if you guys have tried this, but role play with a chatbot very quickly. You can actually create your own GPTs. So if we find that learners, especially advanced learners, maybe there are 2, or maybe there's just 1 learner and they're not getting the stimulation they need because the other learners can't converse with them at that level. Do you know what? With even with ChatGPT, you could put it on speaking mode, and you'll have to create the prompt for the learners because you don't want them to go off topic, and they can actually have a conversation with them in English with the ChatGPT. I actually have someone who's doing a research project on that at the moment, so it's quite interesting to see how that improves speaking overall. But that's a simple way of them being able to converse with somebody who is at that level. Okay, because again, we want to challenge them. We want them to be able to speak and be engaged. And finally, my other little final one is the grammar and vocabulary, playing with language. Like I said, be observant, because it doesn't necessarily mean that these learners, especially L1 native speakers, that they actually have the competence in terms of looking at it explicitly, looking at grammar. Okay, but we can use grammar and vocabulary creatively. Like I said, I gave you the example before with the messy texts where you compare the language. We can use the Feynman technique here, where they can teach small bits of grammar because it helps you check if they've got the grammar as well. Asking them to use grammar and lexis in a longer text. So basically being able to explore how grammar or vocabulary shapes emotions, purposes of functions. And let me just say, because I wanted to say, because this is, let me just go back a bit here. Sorry, I just wanted to say something else here. I missed that. This one here on the writing, which actually even links to the grammar, this is such a cool activity. You can get AI to produce a text with lots of errors. Don't overdo it, but spelling errors, grammar errors, vocabulary. And then that actually is a grammar activity, because then you can print it out. And then you can say to learners, okay, work in pairs, and I want you to find what are the errors in this text. That's a great editing technique. It also makes them aware of language, grammar, and vocabulary. So creating a text with errors in it. So that's another idea for more upgraded grammar and vocabulary tasks. Are we still here with me? Because now it's going to be your turn. Good. So I've come to the end of my part. I'm so glad that you're still here. We're still holding strong. And what we're going to do now is, with what I've explored, which really is the tip of the iceberg. These are just some of my ideas. When I was exploring New World and Open World, we're now going to ask you to take what we've explored. It doesn't have to be what we've looked at, but please feel free to explore this. And what we're going to do is, I want you to connect this directly to your own teaching. So in a moment, I don't know if it should be done, you're going to receive this PowerPoint presentation as a PDF in the chat. So you've got access to it as you go into your breakout rooms. So what you're going to do is you're going to choose a unit or part, whatever you want, a unit, it could be a particular activity that you're currently teaching. You can also choose to pick, one task or skill area, whether that's reading, writing, listening, speaking, or grammar and vocabulary. And then in your breakout rooms, I would like you to discuss what you've heard, what I've shared with you so far. And I would like you to think about how can we upgrade, or how can I upgrade or extend the activity, perhaps using the strategies that were shared today, or using your own ideas. And you can share things that you are doing already that's working with you, because I'd definitely like to hear about those ideas when we come back. Following the breakout session, which is going to be 15 minutes, we're going to come back and hopefully you will want to share some of your ideas, because I'd love to hear your ideas. And then on the slide, you will also find a link to a Padlet. And we're, like I said to you at the beginning, it would be great, it would be so wonderful if you lovely people can add your idea to the Padlet, which is anonymous, so that if you do that, we'll have a resource that we will then download as a PDF and then share with you by email. Okay, so how did it go? Would anybody like to share any ideas that came up for you during the breakout session? I'd love to hear them myself. Would anybody? You can share in the chat, or you can share out loud. You don't have to show your face, you can just share your voice. Would anybody like to share? Oh, Sylvia.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, hi, Sylvia.
Hi. Nice to see you. Yeah, we were thinking, we really liked your ideas, like of using AI, which is a fantastic tool. Thank God you all teach now and not 20 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's a cool idea. And also with the higher order, thinking order. But we were also thinking, how can we boost them linguistically? How can we make sure that they don't just perform at their level and don't just speak or write the way they can do it anyway, but how do we get them to a higher level?
Well, it depends. It depends what you're meaning by linguistically. Are you suggesting, because linguistically still means about the communicative competences of our learners. And as I said, that's why when I discuss the writing or the grammar vocabulary, we're already, and also those short ways that we can upgrade the text, even there we are challenging them linguistically in terms of the grammar. That's why with the grammar activities but again, you have to be careful, because especially with L1 learners, it doesn't necessarily mean that their grammar competence is going to, and the writing.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the thing. So it's about how we can express themselves effectively using language. But at the same time, and that's why the Feynman technique is actually a really cool one, because, they might be, I've got really good English. Okay, then, but then how would you simplify it? Because even then it might even be difficult for them. I use this technique with my trainee team.
Yeah, it's
if I'm looking at something, a concept, like, okay, now explain it to someone who's a novice. So you challenge them. So remember, when we're talking linguistic, we're very much talking about the communicative competence of our learners and how we can use that, let's say, grammar or the forms, whether that's lexical forms, grammatical forms, to challenge them. So even those texts where they can see, ventured, okay, what does that mean? So we're looking at lexical and grammar.
Exactly. But then how do you get them to use it in writing and lift them to the next level in writing?
Well, there we go. If you're comparing, or if you're having a look at, let's say, grammar and lexical item, let's just take grammar and vocabulary. one challenge is, okay, now I want you to use these choose.
Yeah, exactly.
employ. You've got to use this in a text. So when you write
Exactly.
your
Yeah.
blog post, I want to see the use, for example, of the present perfect. They
Yeah,
might know it
exactly.
intuitively because, like I said, with second language acquisition, they may know that already. But when you're asking them to actually explicitly use the grammar, that's where the challenge is. And that's a good way, like you said, quite right, Sylvia, how we can then transfer that.
Exactly. Yeah, cool. Yeah, very nice.
Writing is always a problem for everybody, for L1 learners.
Exactly. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Sylvia. How did that go then for everybody? Was that, and of course, if you do have questions, you can write to Clet with any questions that you might think of after. But I hope, how did that go for everybody? Was that okay for you guys? Good, that makes me happy. Good. All right then. So I'm going to say thank you so much for attending today on my part. I really enjoyed it. And I hope you got something out of this. You have the slides. Use it. It's not just for here. Apply them, because it'd be so cool to hear how you got on. And yeah, so thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Isabel, for inviting me to do this. And I really hope that we have the opportunity to do something again in future. And I hope you guys will come along again. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you. Clap, clap, clap for all of you.
Ja, danke vielmals, Dina. Ist wirklich eine ganz spannende Präsentation gewesen. Ich hoffe, Ihnen hat es allen gefallen. Und ja, dann wünsche ich allen einen wunderschönen Abend und ja, bis ein anderes Mal.